Hello, everyone. Welcome to the International News Program, airing today, Saturday, May 31, 2025, at 3:21 p.m. plus 07. Today, we'll dive deeply into the most significant news from the United States. Trump's mass firings at several agencies will remain on hold, appeals court rules. What's the background of this news, and how does it impact society, politics, and the economy? Stay tuned and smile with us. Background of the mass firings. The mass firings at several U.S. federal agencies have sparked controversy since President Donald Trump took office again in 2025. Trump's policy seeks to reduce the federal workforce and reform agencies, arguing it cuts costs and boosts administrative efficiency. Affected agencies include the Environmental Protection Agency (EPA), the Department of Labor, the Department of Health, and the Department of Education, key institutions with a combined workforce of over 2.1 million across the U.S. The policy kicked off in January 2025 with a plan to cut 10% of staff in major agencies, totaling around 210,000 employees. Trump leveraged his executive authority, bolstered by his 2024 election victory, to push this agenda. He claims the reductions could save the administration $50 billion annually and streamline government operations. However, the plan faced immediate backlash from federal employee unions, civil society organizations, and the Democratic Party. Critics argue that these mass firings would severely disrupt critical public services, including environmental oversight, worker rights protection, and healthcare services. For instance, at the EPA, workforce cuts could weaken air and water quality monitoring, posing risks to public health. Latest update. Appeals court ruling. On May 31, 2025, an appeals court ruled that the Trump administration's mass firings at several agencies will remain on hold as legal challenges proceed. This decision upholds a prior injunction, blocking Trump from moving forward with plans to cut 210,000 jobs and restructure federal agencies. The ruling came after lawsuits from federal employee unions, such as the American Federation of Government Employees (AFGE), and Democrats, who argue the policy is illegal and violates worker rights protected under the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act. The court found that the firings lack a clear legal basis and that the Office of Personnel Management (OPM) does not have sufficient authority to implement mass layoffs across agencies without congressional approval. Additionally, the court noted that the firings could cause significant harm to public services, further justifying the pause. Reasons for the firings and opposition. Trump's mass firing policy is rooted in his goal to dismantle the deep state, a term he uses to describe federal employees he believes obstruct his agenda. He has targeted workers he perceives as politically opposed, particularly at agencies like the EPA and the Department of Health, which he sees as barriers to his deregulation and economic growth policies. Trump argues that these firings would make his administration more efficient and reduce unnecessary spending. However, federal unions, such as the AFGE, strongly oppose the policy, arguing that the firings lack justification and violate labor rights enshrined in federal law. They highlight that workforce cuts would disrupt essential public services that millions of Americans rely on. For example, at the EPA, reduced staff could lead to weaker pollution oversight, increasing respiratory illnesses and other health issues. At the Department of Labor, cuts could undermine programs supporting the unemployed and protecting workers' rights. Key events in the legal process. The legal battle over these firings began in January 2025 when the Trump administration laid off 5,000 EPA employees and 3,000 Department of Labor staff. The layoffs faced immediate pushback from unions, who filed lawsuits in federal court. In February 2025, a federal judge in Washington, D.C. issued an initial injunction, ruling that the OPM lacked authority to fire employees across agencies without congressional approval. However, in April 2025, an appeals court overturned this injunction, allowing the firings to proceed. On May 23, 2025, another federal judge issued a new injunction, halting both the workforce reductions and executive branch restructuring. Finally, on May 31, 2025, the appeals court reaffirmed the injunction, ensuring the firings remain on hold until a final decision is reached. Consequences of the court ruling. The appeals court's decision provides temporary relief to tens of thousands of federal employees at risk of losing their jobs. It also prevents the restructuring of federal agencies, which could have disrupted critical public services. For instance, at the EPA, this pause may preserve air quality programs that protect communities from industrial pollution. However, the ruling has frustrated Trump supporters, who believe the workforce cuts would save taxpayer money and align the government with Trump's vision. They argue that many federal employees oppose Trump's policies, and the firings are a necessary step to remove these obstacles. Long-term impacts. If this legal battle drags on, it could hinder the Trump administration's ability to implement its policies, particularly in sectors reliant on federal agencies. For example, delays at the EPA could stall Trump's campaign promise to roll back environmental regulations. Moreover, the ruling creates uncertainty for federal employees, potentially lowering morale and productivity. Many workers may feel insecure in their roles, prompting some to seek private sector jobs. This could lead to a brain drain in federal agencies, further weakening their capacity to serve the public. The decision may also spark new debates about employee rights and executive power in the U.S. It could lead to reforms in federal labor laws or new legislation to protect federal workers from arbitrary layoffs. Social and political analysis. American society is deeply divided on this issue. Trump supporters view the firings as necessary for reforming an inefficient government and cutting wasteful spending. They believe many federal employees are ideologically opposed to Trump's agenda, and the firings would align the government with his vision. On the other hand, opponents, including unions and Democrats, see the firings as an attack on workers' rights and public services. They argue that federal employees are the backbone of public services, and workforce cuts would harm vulnerable communities the most. Politically, the ruling has heightened tensions between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats are using this issue to challenge the Trump administration, accusing it of prioritizing political gain over public needs. Republicans, meanwhile, view the court's decision as an obstacle to necessary government reform, which they believe is crucial for economic growth. Economic impact and job market analysis. The pause on these firings has significant economic implications. If the firings had proceeded, the loss of 210,000 jobs could have increased the U.S. unemployment rate. Estimates suggest that federal employees contribute approximately $150 billion annually to the national economy through their spending in local communities. Job losses on this scale would have ripple effects on local economies, particularly in states with large federal workforces, such as Maryland and Virginia, home to many federal headquarters. Reduced spending by federal employees could hurt local businesses, including grocery stores, restaurants, and other services. However, the pause also has potential downsides. Trump supporters argue that workforce cuts would save administrative costs, which could be redirected to projects like tax cuts or infrastructure investment. The delay may postpone these initiatives, potentially impacting long-term economic growth. Diverse perspectives on the issue. This issue has elicited varied perspectives from experts and the public. Some political analysts believe the mass firings are part of Trump's strategy to appeal to conservative voters who view the federal government as bloated and inefficient. Public administration experts, however, warn that cutting staff without a clear plan could create chaos in federal agencies and impair the government's ability to respond to crises, such as natural disasters or pandemics. Historical context of government reform in the U.S. Mass firings are not new in U.S. history. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan pursued a similar policy of reducing the federal workforce to shrink the government. Reagan's policies also faced opposition and led to later labor law reforms. In the 1990s, President Bill Clinton launched the Reinventing Government initiative, aiming to make the government more efficient. However, Clinton's approach focused on technology and cost-saving measures rather than mass layoffs. Trump's 2025 policy is seen as a return to Reagan-era conservative tactics but with greater controversy due to today's polarized political climate. Conclusion. The appeals court's ruling to halt Trump's mass firings is a critical development for U.S. governance. From its background, reasons, events, consequences, and analysis, it underscores the complexity of politics, law, and economics in America. Stay with us for more updates. See you next time. Goodbye.